Okay, mi chiamo. Give me a couple of seconds. Just finishing setting up a little bit. All right, can y'all let me know if the sound is good? You can hear me? Can somebody send me a message? All right, can everybody hear me? Only way you can send a message in the chat is if you log in. All right, just give me another second. Okay, I'm going to type in the document for Awuku just for people who haven't seen it yet. This is the information we'll be talking about. Okay, you can hear me good? Cool. Alright, so this is the document, Akradinbosom Awuku, that you can download now. So, mi chiamo, medinde Odwirafo Kwesi ra Nehem Ptah Akan, akwamumain amaruka tifimu Odwirafo, that means my name is Kwesi ra Nehem Ptah Akan. I'm the Odwirafo of the Akwamu nation in North America. This is AKANFO, NANASOM, ancient authentic Akan ancestral religion. We started a series on the Akradin Abosom. We're on Awuku. We started off with Awusi. The Akradin Abosom are the Abosom, the deities that govern the 7-day week, the solar, lunar, and planetary bodies which govern the 7-day week, which comprise the different energies that determine the different days. So we started off with Awusi, Sunday, Kwesi da. We went to Ajwa, who's the same as Aset. Awusi is Asar. Ajwa is Aset. We went to Abena, which is Sekhmet. We went to Bena last week, which is Heru Behudet. And today we're dealing with Awuku. So before we get started with that, were there any questions from the previous session dealing with Bena? All right, anybody have a question on that? Okay, so let's get into Awuku. Awuku is the Abosom that governs the Ochin Nsoroma, which means planet in Akan language. The Ochin Nsoroma called Aku or Awuku. It can also be called Akua or Aquia. That particular planet is called Mercury in English. It's the closest Ochin Nsoroma when we're dealing with the Akradinbosom to the Oriya, to the sun. So Awuku, or Awuku is also called Kweku Anansi. This is the Abosom, the divinity that operates through that planet. Awuku is called the divine messenger, the divine communicator. He's a communicator of the Supreme Being to us. We communicate through Awuku to the Abosom, to the Nsamanfo, and Awuku communicates the messages of Inyame wa Inyame, the Abosom and Nsamanfo, to us. Just like in your body, you have a nervous system. It is the communicative structure in the body. The nerves are your worldwide web in your body. Anansi, Awuku, governs that process. Now, we hear about the name Anansi because we hear about Anansi stories. Anansi means spider in Akan culture. So they often talk about Anansi being the trickster. There's another title of Anansi, which is Anansi Kokroko, which means the great Anansi. Now, when we talk about Anansi Kokroko, you'll often read that title, and the authors will often say that Anansi Kokroko has to do with a title of Nyankumpon, which means the supreme being. That is inaccurate. That comes from European writers as well as Ghanaians who have been influenced negatively by Europeans, writers, but also those who've been connected to Christianity, Islam, and so forth, and got a corruption of the culture. So what they began to do, which we spoke about before, is they would take names of Abosom, names of divinities, the children of the Supreme Being, the spirits that operate through the planets, sun, moon, stars, the earth, mother, the rivers, the oceans, and so forth. They tried to say that we were monotheistic because they wanted to measure themselves against the false religions of Islam and Christianity once the whites and their offspring invaded and gained some control over the population. They wanted to appear to be not primitive, and the whites and their offspring, of course, teach that monotheism is intelligence and polytheism represents primitive mind state. In reality, they know it's false. They just don't want us to communicate with the Abosom, the forces of nature, because when we do that and we connect with divine order and our Nsamafo, then we recognize that, of course, we shouldn't be following the whites and their offspring. We shouldn't allow them to rule us, and we should be eradicating them as opposed to trying to emulate them. So that's the reason, of course, why they push this whole notion of monotheism, and then, of course, the representative of the false monotheistic deity is them. The reality is there are many Abosom, many Orisha, many Ntoru, many divinities, which is often written Netaru or Netertu, but it's really Ntoru. So what happens is one of the titles of Anansi Kokroko, the great Anansi, meaning the great spider, that title was through foolishness attached to Nyankumpon, meaning the creator in the Akan language. In reality, Anansi Kokroko just represents the cosmic divine function of Anansi as the great spider, and he's also a communicator. What is the connection between Anansi, a force in nature that operates as the masculine aspect of the divine nervous system within the great divine body? Inyamewa, Inyame, the great mother and the great father, who we call Amenet and Amen, or Amenet Ra'et and Amen Ra in ancient Kamit, the great mother and the great father. In Akan we say Inyame, the great mother goddess, and Inyame Wa, the great mother goddess, Inyame, the great god, who together comprise the supreme being. They have children, which are the organs within their divine body. So you have a body, you have organs, which are smaller bodies, which regulate the functions of the entire body, and they serve the great body, which is you. The different organs within the body of the supreme being, of course, are the Abosom. That's what we call them in Akan. They're called Orisha in Yoruba culture. They're called Vodou in Fon and Ewe culture, and so forth. One of the structures in the great divine body is the divine communicative structure, which is the nervous system. Anansi, or Awuku, also called Aku or Kweku, but Aku, he is the masculine aspect of that divine communicative structure, the great divine nervous system within the great divine body. Now, the connection between that and him being called Anansi, meaning spider, is if you look at a spider, and we mentioned this on the website and in the article, a spider could be on a windowsill, and then you come back days later, and the spider has woven an intricately woven web within the entire empty space of the window. Now, previous to that, of course, spiders cannot fly, so they couldn't move within that empty space. But once they weave the web, now the spider can move to any point in that empty space and remain there as long as they want. They govern that entire empty space. They are the ruler of that entire empty space. And even if other insects come through who fly, they get caught up And sometimes that's the way spiders trap their meals, by catching them up in the web. And those webs, when they're tied together, can be very strong. So just like you have a World Wide Web like we utilize as a communicative structure, your nervous system is the World Wide Web in your body. Anansi or Awuku weaves a web of Tumi, which is divine energy that creates the universe. Anansi weaves a web of Tumi, or divine life force energy, throughout the black substance of space, throughout the Ka and the Kayet. His web of energy permeates the entire black substance of space, just like the web within the space of the window. And then he can move through any aspect of space to anyone, to any plant life, animal life, mineral life, Afurakani, Afurakaini, human life, the ancestral spirits, the Abosom, and communicate with all of them. Now, if you look at, we talked about having an Akra, an Ori Inu, a Ka, a Kaet. We have a divine consciousness, a divine entity, our own personal divinity dwelling within our head. It's our direct connection to Inyame wa Inyame. It is a portion of the consciousness or the soul of Inyame wa Inyame placed within us. It's a miniature divinity that we can feel it pulling us in one direction or another. We try to communicate. That's our purpose spiritually, is to live in alignment with the Akra, with the pull of the Akra. We communicate with our Akra. We live in harmony with our Akra, because in our soul, in our divine consciousness, is our function, our very life focus, our purpose for being in the world, given to us by Inyame wa Inyame. The reason why there's a direct connection energetically is because one of those strands of Tumi that's woven by Anansi, one end is connected to our Akra, and the other end is connected directly to Inyame wa Inyame. So every entity, living, created entity, which has an Akra, an Akrawa, a Ka or Kayet, and of course only created entities have that. The whites and their offspring, Asians, Europeans, white Americans, white Latinos, Latinas, so-called Native Americans, none of them have an Akra, so they don't have that direct connection to Inyame wa Inyame. Anansi literally permeates the black substance of space with this web of Tumi, and every created entity has a connection or a place on the web directly connected to the Akra, to the Supreme Being. So Anansi, as a force in nature, just like the electric impulses moving through your nervous system, from the brain through every aspect of your nervous system, sending impulses and messages going back and forth, Anansi is that messenger. In fact, the term Anansi, the word se means to speak. Esain means messenger. Like a messenger is a herald or a communicator. So for example, in an Akan court, you will have the Oheni, the king, we talked about that before, the spokesperson, the Ocheame for the king, standing next to the king, who is the mouthpiece for the king, for the Oheni. When the Oheni makes a declaration, he speaks to his mouthpiece, which is the Ocheame, and the Ocheame speaks to the public, the people in the court, about what the Oheni has decreed, or what the Ohema, the Queen Mother, has decreed. Once that message has been shared by the mouthpiece of the Oheni, then the herald, the Esain, takes the message from the court that was just legislated basically, and goes all throughout the kingdom, runs all throughout the kingdom, the queendom, the nation, the Omai, and delivers that message. So just like you have your pituitary gland, which is like the Oheni and the Ohema in their aspect of Awusi and Adwa, like Alsar and Alset. Then you have the Ocheame, which is like Tahuti, the pineal gland that reflects light and gives messages and secretes hormones and so forth. Then you have the Esain. Now also with Tahuti, there's also Tekit and Seshat, the female counterpart, and Tahuti is the male counterpart, the divine wisdom, giving those messages, the mouthpiece of the Supreme Being. Then you have the Esain, the messenger, who takes the information coming from the pituitary gland and pineal, the brain structure and sends those messages all throughout the web, throughout the network. So the Esane is a little messenger who takes the message from the court, the sacred wisdom, and the declarations, and goes all around the Oman, the nation, to deliver those messages. So just like that happens in the body, it happens in the, in the Oman, in the nation, it also happens spiritually. Anansi takes the messages from Inyame wa Inyame, from the Abosom, from the Nsamanfo, the NANASOM Nsamanfo, Asamanfo Pa, takes those messages from Asamando, the spirit realm, the ancestral realm, and carries them directly to us through that energetic link of Tumi that is connected right from our Akra directly to the spirit realm. He carries those messages to us, and then he carries our messages to the spirit realm and between each other, all of us who have an Akra. So that's a direct connection. Just like the World Wide Web that we're using right now, it's the same structure, and in fact it's modeled on the same structure. So as saying, se means to speak, as saying means messenger, courier or messenger. Anan means foot. So Anan se means basically a traveling messenger. And so Anansi is shown as a messenger moving throughout all of creation, going back and forth to heaven and earth. When you read the Anansi Sim, the Anansi stories, it talks about Anansi going fluidly from heaven to earth, going to speak to Inyamewa, to Inyame, coming back, talking to the Abosom, talking to people on earth, talking to the animals. He talks to everyone, and he's the owner of all the stories. So that's the number one primary function of Anansi. He is called Eshu in Yoruba culture. He's called Legba in Fon and Ewe culture in Vodun. This is the same Abosom, the exact same divinity. We communicate with the same Abosom. Just like all of us can look and see the sun, and in our different languages, Akan, Ewe, Yoruba, and so forth, we have different names for that specific entity. We have a different name. Very often they're closely related for the same entity, and this is Anansi. He's called Eshu, Legba, Alagbara in Yoruba, and also called Legba in Vodun. Now, Anansi is also called Set in ancient Kamit. He's called Set. Sometimes you'll see it spelled Set, and in Coptic it'll be spelled with the sounds. It'll be spelled with a C, E, and T, which is pronounced. That particular C is like the C in the English cell phone, so it's pronounced Set. But there's also a pronunciation of Sut, S-U-T. So you have both in ancient Kamit. So Set and Sut in ancient Kamit becomes Anan, Set in Akan, and Su or Eshu in Yoruba. So it's the same divinity. The sacred colors of Anansi typically are red and black. You'll find red and black in the Yoruba tradition. You'll find Set depicted as either red when he's called Desher, which means red, or he's depicted as black. Excuse me. And in Akan culture, there's a connection between the red and the black. In fact, his name is Anansi, Awuku, Aku Anansi. He's also called Ku, which is a version of Kueku or Kwaku. But Ko means red, and that's directly connected with Anansi as well. Now let's deal with the red and the black, because we brought that up briefly before, but we want to get into some more information about that. The red and the black in ancient Kamit, Kam means black, K-A-M, that means black. Kamet means the black country. The Kamal means the black people. Desher means red. Desheru means the red people. Deshert means the red land, or the red country. So you have Kamet and Deshert. The black land, the red land. The black country, the red country. Now Europeans, so-called Egyptologists, have tried to make a controversy out of these terms and say that, well, you know, it doesn't mean black people. Kamal doesn't mean black people. It just meant the black silk that was brought up from the river, and that deals with fertility. It has nothing to do with black people. It has nothing to do with, you know, ethnicity. Of course, that's not accurate. And then some of them will try to say, well, you know, the people dealing with Set, that had to do with Europeans, red, ruddy-skinned, reddish people. So they tried to associate themselves with a divinity, and they also tried to disassociate us from a divinity. The reality is the red and black is sacred. Yes, it has to do with the country. Yes, it has to do with the land. You have the fertile land of the strip of Kamit, which is a fertile land along the banks of the river. It's black silk, black mud. It's fertile. It's Kamit. And then right outside of the fertile land, you have the red land, which is the desert, where we get desert from, because that's the desert. And that is the domain of Set. You will find stories in Akan culture where it talks about how Awusi or Kwesi, which is Awusi, which is Asar, and Anansi had a battle, and the battle ended up where Set got the infertile land, and Anansi got the infertile land, and Anansi became the owner of the desert. In ancient Kemet, Set is the owner of the desert. Hold on 1 second. Okay, had to check that right quick. So Set is called the owner of the desert in ancient Kemet. He's called Desert or Desher, the red one. His followers are called Desheru, the red ones. In Akan culture, Anansi is the owner of the desert. In Kemet, Set is the Abosom that operates through the planet Set, or the planet Mercury, also called Sobek. In Akan culture, Anansi or Awuku operates through the planet Mercury. That's why he's called Kweku Anansi, and his day is Awukuda, which is Wednesday. So the same Abosom that operates through the desert and operates through the planet Mercury in Kemet is the same divinity that operates through the desert and operates through the planet Mercury, or Awuku, in Akan. So yes, the land masses, black and red, that's true. But the people are connected to the Abosom. So when we talk about our people being Kamal, black people, or talking about our people being Desheru, red people, we're talking about dark brown people with black undertones, or dark brown people with red undertones. And when you can see, for example, the Maasai, we mentioned that before, and different ethnic groups, you'll see they're dark brown. So if you just saw them walking down the street, you can say there's a dark brown person, a black person, unmixed, having no, miscegenation in their, past. They're, perfectly black. But when you see them in a certain light, you will see they have red undertones. Then you see another dark brown person, and then they have black undertones. For example, like the Dinka and some other groups, Wolof and others. But they exist in all the different groups. That's the difference between the red people and the black people, the Kamal and the Desheru. We're all in reality the black people, but those significators have to do with undertones. And of course, we're naturally drawn to those different areas based on the energy of the divinities that govern us. Our life force energy is conditioned by the Abosom who govern our Kra. So some of those people who are connected to that fiery, hot, those fiery, hot, dry areas, they happen to be governed by fiery, hot divinities, and their undertones will manifest that energy. The people who are governed by the divinities dealing with fertility and a little bit slightly cooler than the ones in the red areas, the hot, red, dry areas, those people will develop black undertones, and they'll be drawn more to that. So what you have is dark brown people with black undertones, dark brown people with red undertones. So you have the Kamal and the Desheru. That same scheme exists in Akan culture. You'll find in certain Akan subgroups and families, certain Abusia or Musia families, that there is a red line of a kingship. Like, for example, in the Asante ethnic subgroup of the Akan people in the Oyoko Abusia or Yoko clan, you will find that they have a red line of kings, which they call the Koko, and then they have a black line of kings, which are called Tum Tum. Now, it's not because the red ones are light skinned and the black ones are dark skinned. If you see representative of the Koko, for example, Ejimai Prempe, the Asante Hene, who was Asante Hene up until about what they call 1924, around that time, and he was the one who was exiled in the islands after the Europeans took over in early 12,900s or 1900. He was exiled with his retinue of his people. He's considered Kaka or red. Now, when you see a picture of him, he's a dark brown black person, but he's considered of the red line, where you have others who are considered the Kaka line, which others are considered the Tum Tum line, the black line. So when you see that, and then you can see in other different groups, you start paying attention. Anybody you come in contact with from the continent, you can look, as well as our people here, you can look and determine which ones have those red undertones, which ones have the black undertones. It has nothing to do with miscegenation. It has to do with the energy that governs us. Okay, so we want to clear that part up with regard to Set and also with Eshu. So that's why we have these black and red motif running throughout the continent dealing with that. There's another issue that often comes up with regard to Set, because, well, first before we get to that, it's dealing with the whole piece about Sika, about money and things like that. Well, no, maybe we should do it now because it's kind of tied into some other information. Anansi is called Eku Sika in Akan. That's a praise name, and Mrane, a praise name. Eku or Aku, of course, means Awuku, Kweku, the Abosom that governs the planet, Awuku. Sika means money, but it infers money. It means gold, but it infers money because we use gold as a medium of exchange. So Eku Sika has to do with money, mediums of exchange. Anansi. In the Yoruba tradition, you'll hear people say Eshu or Legba is in the bank. So if people work in the bank or they have something to do with the bank, having to do with money, they'll say, oh, well, Eshu is in the bank, Legba is in the bank. There's an association with the communicative divinity and money. The association is money is a medium of exchange. Just like communication, that's all about exchange. Our verbiage is a medium of exchange. When we have certain thoughts, intentions, and actions, and we express them and we want to project them to the Abosom, project them to the NANASOM and Samanfo, project them to Inyamewa Inyame, it is Anansi who takes those thoughts, intentions, and actions, that energy that's generated within us, and formulates it into a message that can be conveyed. It's turned into a medium of exchange. The verbiage, the words, the certain configuration of vibrations that actually fits the thoughts, intentions, and desires that we have to communicate. He has the whole catalog of vibratory waves, rates, frequencies, and so forth that fit our thoughts, intentions, and desires, and he can wrap that up and then communicate it properly to the Abosom, to the Nsamafo, to Inyamewa Inyame, and communicate to others who have an Okra. So the words, the vibrations, sound waves become a medium of exchange in your and that's in your body as well, but also in your body and your nervous system. Those electric impulses that carry the messages from the brain throughout the nervous system, and Anansi is the messenger going back and forth carrying these messages. Those electric impulses, that tumi, that energy that he uses all throughout the nervous system, That's a medium of exchange. And then Sika, money, or any form of money that's natural that we use. Sometimes we use in Serewa, cowrie shells. We've also used the sacred mineral, Sika, or gold. But it again is a way that we convey thoughts and intentions, what we need, what we desire, and then we communicate that with by exchange, if it's a balanced exchange. Now, as the energy is moving through the nervous system, or we're exchanging, desires or needs with one another through currency or any kind of exchange, Anansi moving through that nervous system, constantly generating energy through the nervous system, it manifests that energy emanations of what we would call desire. Now, desire can be guided, properly guided, in harmony with order, or desire can be misguided. So if you're very hot outside one day, running around, exercising, moving back and forth quickly, it's very hot, and you have the desire to drink some cool water, that's a natural desire. That's a naturally guided desire. That's normal. In that sense, the desire is in harmony with a need, so it's a real desire. And then you fulfill that desire to bring balance to yourself. Now, you can also have conditionings that create artificial desires, like wanting to be connected to the Odwirafo, wanting to worship a fictional white divinity who doesn't exist. That's a desire. It's a manufactured desire. It doesn't bring balance to you. It either creates imbalance or promotes imbalance or sustains imbalance that's already been created within you. That's not a legitimate need. It's not based on divine order. It has nothing to do with your Akra. It has nothing to do with your Nkrabia, your divine function. So it's a misguided desire. That's a lust. So the energy moving through your nervous system, as it's pulsating through your nervous system, it generates that energy that we consider a manifestation of desire. That's why Set governs desire. Now, desire can be guided again, or it can be misguided. So when you look at the story of Alsar, Alset, and Heru, you have Alsar, the great king, the Kam-Ur, or the great black king. They talk about Set basically having misguided desire, wanting to be the ruler, kills Alsar, takes over the rule of the country, rules it like a tyrant with his followers until Heru rises up, grows up. Heru represents or manifests through the will, through the heart. And that's coming up in the next couple of weeks. We're going to talk about Heru operating within the heart. One of his titles is Heru Ami Abu, which means Heru within the heart. So you have the desire and the will, Set and Heru in conflict. Now, in reality, we're not talking about two Abosom in conflict. The different energy complexes that they govern are your energy complexes. If you get out of harmony with those energy complexes, you have left the Abosom alone. You're out of harmony with them. So we don't say, for example, that if your desire is in harmony with order, you're in harmony with Awuku, with Set. If you engage in misguided desire, and you just step out of the harmony with the Abosom, and now that desire that you're operating on is lust, is a perversion of your natural desire, so you're not dealing with Anansi anymore. So that story is showing not only the interaction between the will and the desire, and how they should be in harmony. It's like drinking the water when you're hot. You have the will, you have the desire, and it's all harmonious, so it all brings and restores balance. But there is a possibility that you can get outside of balance. And the story shows that what happens when somebody gets out of balance with the Abosom and they start deviating from divine order, then the whole social order is overturned. That'll happen inside your body, it can happen inside your spirit, it'll happen inside your family, it'll happen within the nation, and so forth. So we're not talking about deities fighting each other. We're talking about the energy that governs these divinities. If they govern our Kra, and we need to live in harmony with them, and so forth. Now, because Set governs desire, magnetic attraction for things that we either want or things that we need, but it should be things wanted, needed, and wanted should be in alignment. They talk about Set being the trickster. You'll hear that in ancient Kamit. You'll hear about that in the Yoruba tradition, that Eshu was the divine trickster. In ancient Kamit, Set tried to trick Heru. You read the different papyri, the contendings of Heru and Set, that great story, and they talk about the contention and the different contests that were waged between Heru and Set trying to trick Heru out of his inheritance. Then you also have the various Anansi Sem, which are the Anansi stories in Akan culture, and it's all about, very often, Anansi, Awuku, Kweku Anansi, trying to trick somebody for one reason or another. When you're talking about an Abosom that governs communication, and that communicative structure has to do with energy that's surging through your system on a regular basis, going back and forth and generating that desire. If you're out of harmony with that desire, then you develop things that you don't need. You make associations with people you don't need to make associations with. You will twist anything to fit that lustful desire if you're out of harmony with the energy. You will make up rationalizations for things that don't even exist, that are not even necessary, that are actually self-destructive. Because you have this desire, you will use your mind, you'll use your adwini, you'll use your physical body to control situations or control other people to satisfy the desire. You'll use your mind to manufacture ridiculous rationales to satisfy the desire. So people will say, well, Set is the trickster. Anansi is the trickster. He leads you into certain areas and then tricks you, and if things blow up in your face. In reality, Anansi, yes, it's a trick in a certain sense, but it's really Anansi responding to your misguided desire. If you look cosmologically, we talked about Anansi sitting like a spider on the web and governing the entire web of Tumi that permeates all of creation. In a very similar sense, you'll see in the Yoruba tradition an Oponifa, which is a divining tray. It's a circular tray where they do divination, use that tray for divination. On the top of the tray, you'll see the face of Eshu very often. What happens, and they'll talk about Eshu governs the crossroads. When you're at a crossroads situation, you have to make decisions. Which way are you going to go? And Eshu is sitting right there in the crossroads, and you know, you make, depending on what decision you make, that determines the course of your life. It's the same thing in Akan culture. Anansi, operating through the Tumi that permeates like a web all of the black substance of space, he sits on the perimeter of the created order. He's there. That perimeter, all those roads that you find within the cobweb, he governs all of those, just like the spider governs all of the different roads within the cobweb in the window, and nobody can run that system except for the spider. Anansi sits on the perimeter of the created order. He manages the possibility of disorder. He does not create disorder, he manages the possibility. The fact that disorder is possible, he manages that, and he mediates the law of cause and effect. So he sits on the perimeter of created order. Everything within that circle is the created order, but if you try to move outside of that perimeter, Anansi is right there reposing on the perimeter. Once you go beyond him, you are outside of the created order. Now you are in disorder, and you are eligible for destruction, punishment, or destruction. And that comes from Bena, that comes from Abena, that comes from Yao, Ya, Abba, and other Abosom. So it's not the sense that Anansi is trying to trick people. For example, if he's sitting on the perimeter of the created order, and he's the go-between between yourself, and you have Anansi here, and the Abosom and Samanfo, and Inyame wa Inyame, who's directly connected to your Akra through Anansi's web of Tumi. if you have a desire and it's a misguided desire, and you start expressing that desire in your thoughts, in your attentions, eventually your actions, but you expressing this misguided desire to engage in some self-destructive behavior, and you begin to try to make the Abosom or the Nsamanfo your accomplices for validation of your misguided desire. If you want to steal something, if you want to connect with some people like some Ashiwadifo, who of course we shouldn't be connecting with on any level, physically, in relationships and so forth, but if you're or trying to do drugs or making up excuses about why you want to fulfill some misguided desire, and you do ritual, you pray about it, or you're thinking about it, or doing whatever you do, and you project these messages. As soon as you begin to think, you're projecting messages, you're projecting energy. The thoughts don't just remain in your head. Just like when you breathe, by virtue of the fact that you're walking around, you're emanating energy on a regular basis. When you form thoughts in your adjoining, in your mind, you're constantly emanating energy. So when you start to formulate thoughts about what your desires are, you begin to crystallize those thoughts because you focus on them on a regular basis. And these are like matrices of energy. And then you project those up to the Abosom, to the Nsamanfo. You're asking for permission to engage in disordered behavior. Now the Abosom are the embodiments of divine order in creation. So they do not deal with disorder at all, they repel disorder. Inyame wa Inyame repels disorder. So you can try to attempt to project your misguided desires up to Anansi, up to Inyame wa Inyame, but since Anansi sits on the perimeter of the created order, when you project disorder up in the form of thoughts, intentions, ritual prayers, or non-ritual prayers, and you project that kind of energy up to, or you attempt to project it up to Inyame wa Inyame, then Anansi repels it and sends it right back to you. Now, when you get that energy coming back to you, you can try to delude yourself and say, well, I got a response from the Abosom and they said it's all right because I sent that energy up and it came right back, it must be okay. And then you move forward and engage in the behavior, and then it blows up in your face and you suffer some form of loss, whether it's spiritual or even physical, financial, whatever. Then they say, well, Anansi just tricked me. I prayed, I tried to communicate, I asked what I wanted to do, he said it was okay, and all this other foolishness. It wasn't a trick. It was you trying to trick the Nsamanfo, you going against your Akra. You know your Akra is leading you against this behavior, but you're trying to go and engage in the behavior anyway. So you try to consult with the Abosom, consult with Inyame wa Inyame, consult with the NANASOM Nsamanfo, the Asamanfo Pa, to try to make them accomplices to your misguided desire, and you project those desires up, and Anansi bats it right back down. You catch it, you move forward with it, and you suffer the consequences. So that's what it means when we're talking about Anansi being a trickster. He's just reversing or repelling the misguided desires that we often push up. Okay, now let me ask if there are any questions about that. Okay. Okay, so the sister asked which story you're referring to. There's a story called, and you can just Google, in fact, let me type it in for you. Kwesi, you can type in Kwesi and Anansi, or okay, so you can type in Kwesi and Anansi, or you can type in how Anansi became the owner of the desert. And when you read that story, it's a long story, but if you were to analyze it, and we did a short analysis of it, it's out online, you'll see that the Kwesi character is really a form of the Awusi of Asar, And of course, Anansi is set, and they go through this, basically this little battle. And at the end of the day, Anansi is, Awusu, Kwesi Awusu, which is Awusi Asar, they call him Kwesi Awusu. He is given by Nyankompon, the creator, by Ra, the fertile land, and then Anansi, because of what he did, he gets the infertile land of the desert. So he gets the red land, and Kwesi Awusu gets the black land, the fertile land. So Kwesi is Awusu, which is Asar, the black land, Kam-Ur, the black one, and Anansi is Set, Desher, the red land, and so forth. So that's the story. And you'll find a number of different translations of that all over the internet. Okay. Any other questions on that aspect? Any questions with regard to Anansi as far as being the communicator? Okay. Okay. So let's deal with the rationale issue, and there's a difference between what we call Anansi Sem, which means Anansi stories, and then Abosom, which means history, but it really in our culture means true story. The literal interpretation of Abosom is Bako means one, and Asem means stories or matter. So Abosom means the one story, which means what we would call in English, what we often say, true story, the true story, the story, as opposed to his story is Abosom, the true story, and Abosom is sacred. Anansi Sem are like myths, folk tales, stories that are not considered to necessarily be true, but they have truth in them and they have morals and so forth. There are stories about how Anansi became the owner of all stories because he met a challenge that was given by Nyankompon, which is the creator, which is Ra in ancient Akan culture, and the stories became known. Every story, every myth became owned by Anansi. He's the owner of all the stories, and they are called Anansi Sem. Now, we need to deal with Anansi Sem in connection with Abosom, in connection with Awuku, because when you're dealing outside of harmony with Awuku, the one who communicates, he communicates all of the stories of Nyankompon and Nyankonton. He's a communicative faculty in the universe, within your body, your brain, central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system. Anansi is governing that. If you're out of harmony with Anansi, if you're out of harmony with Awuku, then your communications will be not correct. And this is critical when we talk about Afurakani, Afurakaidi ancestral religion, ancestral culture, ancestral nation building, and restoration. The reason why we have so many problems with respect to all three of those areas, religion, culture, and nation building, which totally is our tradition. So you have NANASOM, which is a term that we use for Afurakani, Afurakaidi ancestral religion, Amamre, which means the way of the nation, which means culture, and then you have Ama-Ancestral, which is nation building or restoration. And that in total, that we will call Amaniye, which means the things of the nation or our traditions. So if you're not in harmony with Anansi, your rationale for thinking, acting, engaging in certain behavior, and the direction of your life, and eventually the direction of your family, the direction of the nation, is going to be in a totally different, disordered, imbalanced direction. The whites and their offspring initially, they engaged in warfare. They invaded our countries for thousands of years. They were waging war against people in North Afurakai, South, Central, East, West. They waged war against our people in Southern Europe, in the so-called Middle East, in Southern India, of course in Southern China, in North, Central, and South America, and the Caribbean. They were waging war whenever they came in contact with us. They were not ate for thousands of years. Typically, they were unsuccessful. They typically did not gain a foothold in our countries generation after generation. We speak about it like, well, they waged war for thousands of years and they weren't successful. If we think about the time frame as the people were living in that area, if we think about, for example, the so-called Iraq War, now we think that's a long time, going on for over a decade. That's a very long time. Imagine people waging war not just for a decade, but for decades. From the time that they are young men and women to the time they're in their 70s and 80s and die, the wars are still going on. Then the next generation, the wars continue. And the next generation, the invasions continue. The whites and their offspring were not having success generation after generation. So that we were crushing them on a regular basis. Every now and then they would gain a foothold in the northern part of Kamit or parts of southern Europe, different areas, but typically they were not successful. So we talked about previously that their next move was to infiltrate different centers of civilization and begin to corrupt the culture, just by virtue of the fact that they get connected to the culture in some way through observation, through invasion. They're going to corrupt it just by virtue of the fact that they are spirits of disorder. But they engage in a process of corruption. It didn't happen overnight. They didn't just come in one day, rewrite the religion, and the next year it was over. It took them centuries before they were able to corrupt the traditions to the point they are now. We read about the ecumenical councils, like the Council of Nicaea and the various other councils that took place when they were formulating and refining the false religion of Christianity. There were other councils where they were formulating the false religion of Judaism, Islam, the same thing with Hinduism, same thing with Buddhism. You can read a number of different documents, all kinds of publications going back hundreds of years when they're trying to formulate what they want to believe about Buddhism, what it is, what it's not. What they want to believe about Taoism, what it is, what it's not. What they want to believe the doctrine of Christianity should be, what it is and what it's not. The same thing with Islam, same thing with Judaism. They didn't just have some, just a regular master plan and just put it into effect and it just knocked us out. It took them centuries to get to the point where they are now with these fake traditions. And still, it's only been in the last 100 to 150 plus years that many of our people on the continent, for example, in the western part of the continent, have begun to accept Christianity. Christianity has been there for hundreds of years, but the whites and their offspring typically were not able to force that on us. Islam has been there for hundreds of years. Many of our people didn't accept it. Some of our people accepted it more in the northern parts of the continent, but many of our people in the west, central, east, and southern parts of the continent, we rejected it for hundreds of years, and it's only been more recent that some of our people have began to embrace that foolishness. So the reason why the Achiwadifo, the whites and their offspring, the spirits of disorder, after losing so many military battles and were not successful, began to infiltrate is because they decided if they could corrupt the culture and take us away from the worship of the ancestral spirits, the Abosom, the real supreme being, and to connect with them, then they could use our minds to control the situation in a fashion that supported what they were trying to do. Now, they couldn't just come and force religion, fake religion on us and just, disrupt the religion. They tried that at first. We rejected that. You read in ancient documents when the Greeks and Romans are talking about how they were trying to force Christianity on the people, and all the various arguments they had to make to the people to try to convince them why they should accept this fictional savior, for example. They would say, well, when we talk about, Jesus being born of a virgin, that's no different than your story of Osiris and Horus, as they would say in their writings. So they were sitting there trying to convince people, you need to accept what we're saying. In fact, it's so much like what you're already doing, you might as well just accept it. By virtue of the fact that they were trying to convince our people, it shows a couple of things. One thing is our people weren't going for it, And another thing is they didn't have it down packed yet. They didn't have the method yet. It took them a very long time. That was 2,000 years ago, and it still took them over another 1,000 years before they got to the point where they had a well-oiled machine, and that's only been very recent. So, however, when they finally got to the point when they started presenting this foolishness to our people, they had to go to areas where we were already at odds with one another. They would have to see certain clans who were already at odds with true historical enemies, internecine warfare, and then they would get on one side and introduce that false tradition and try to connect with those people to go against the other people. Now, the people in the country, they didn't care anything about accepting some false doctrine. They didn't see it as a grand plan, and plus they didn't see the whites and their offspring as a threat, because they had never been controlled by white people ever for thousands of years. So they saw them as a weak minority who had no control over anything, but they may have something to help them overcome their enemies on the other side. So that's why some of our people who are disgruntled with the status quo will connect with the whites and their offspring. And they use that process, which they've been continuously doing. Before the military, you would see that they would send the people in with the Bibles, send the missionaries in with the Bibles, send the Muslims in with the Qurans, trying to convince people, disgruntled people, to connect with them and try to show them a way that they, in reality, they could overcome their enemies. When they write about it, they'll say that they just brought the Quran into the country, they brought the Bible into the country, the people were overwhelmed with the wisdom of it, and they had to embrace it because they knew it was the real, true religion. They lie about everything that took place. What they were doing was, they would go in and say, listen, you can't defeat this mortal enemy of yours who has been controlling you and made you a vassal for sometimes decades, sometimes centuries. However, if we connect with you, maybe we can wage war against them together. You need to come up under our banner, though. And some of our people will reject that, but if they were getting tired of being beat down by another group, they would entertain the whites and their offspring, come up under that banner for political expedience purposes, but then they would also plan to go against the whites and their offspring after they were able to come up on top. And we talked about that a little bit with the Asante and the Fonte Nation. So through these processes, they opened themselves up to the enemy, to the whites and their offspring. And some of our people began to listen to them. Some of our people were sent to some of their schools. Very often in our traditional culture, if you have one nation interacting or trading with another nation, you may send, somebody who's a Santi may send one of their children up into the Dagomba area to learn that language, learn the culture, so they would be like an ambassador. And so, it was smooth relations between the two countries. We were accustomed to doing that. Some of our people who were not listening to the Abosom, weren't listening to the Nsamanfo, they would send, just like they did with Afurakani, Afuraikaitni countries, they did the same thing with the whites and their offspring who were trying to ally with them to go against another Afurakani, Afuraikaitni group. So what they would do is sometimes they would send their children to a school or send some of the adults to learn the language, to learn the customs, and so forth. Sometimes some people in Akan culture sent people to Europe, sent them to England, so that they could learn the customs. Some of them were overcome by lust, misguided desire. They wanted more gold, they wanted more money, they wanted more influence, they wanted more prestige for their clan, for their nation, so they would engage in behaviors that were self-destructive. Just by virtue of the fact that they were connected to the Odwirafo, they were engaged in self-destructive behavior. Some of them would accept the false doctrine and then bring it back to the people and say, well, we can use this as an instrument to basically control and get over on the people who we've had a negative relationship with for decades. We can use this as a tool to overcome them. So the people will say, all right, well, we can learn this. If we can use it, we'll use it. Just like some of our people today, even if they're Christians or some of them non-Christians, if they look at a school system and they look at Catholic schools and the public schools, they may not be interested in Catholicism at all, but they'll send their children to white Catholic schools because they think the white Catholic schools are better than the public schools. So they send their children to the white Catholic schools. They typically have a higher graduation rate than the public schools, but the children are very often, not very often, always being indoctrinated with this filthy, false doctrine. And we make that calculation thinking that, well, once they get out, we'll, debrief them, we'll deprogram them from that foolishness, and, we'll get them to do what we're trying to get them to do. We still make those calculations now, after enslavement is, for hundreds of years have happened, after all of the racism and everything we've gone through, we still make those calculations, some of our people, to send our children into that kind of foolishness because we think we can get something out of it. If we can do that now, after everything we've been through, imagine our people on the continent who had never been ruled by the Odwirafo ever. They were in their own countries, had their own empires, had their own military, had everything they needed, and then they saw this weak group of albinos who was trying to ally with them to help them against another Afurakaini group. They would do the same thing. They saw it as an instrument, some of them, those who didn't listen to the Nsamafu, those who didn't listen to the Abosom, those who didn't listen to the Alkra, those who had a desire to overcome the rule of the other group. Their desire led them to ignore the Alkra, ignore the Abosom, not reject the Odwirafo, but accept them because they thought they could use what they had for political expedience purposes. That's the kind of information, that's the kind of calculation that led some of our people to accept these fake traditions. It wasn't just, Odwirafo with the sword and the gun and force that information on us. Some of them tried to do that, but they weren't strong enough to do that all over the continent. It took them using these fake rationales and looking for our people who are engaged in misguided desire to move forward with that. Now let me see. I saw somebody had a question. Okay. Sister asked, is Set the communicator and messenger for Egyptian culture? Yes, so Set is Anansi and Akan, Kwesi Anansi. He's Eshu in the Yoruba tradition, Legba in the Fon Ewe Vodun tradition. If you look at the stories of, in fact, the contendings of Heru and Set, and when Heru and Set are battling back and forth for a while, and eventually, of course, it is decreed that Heru will take his father's place, and Set, even though he was the older, he was the uncle, and he was the brother of Asar, it is not proper for him to be the next king because Asar's heir is there, so Heru was given the throne. Then Ra says, well, Set can come and sit in the boat with me, and then he will broadcast from the boat, and he will be in the prow of the boat of Ra from that point on. So he becomes the communicator for Ra. What happens is, since we know Set operates through the planet Awuku, in Akan culture, as well as in Yoruba, Eshu is connected to the planet Mercury. In Akan culture, the planet Aku, which is Mercury, Akua. In ancient Kamit, Set is connected with the planet Sobek, which is Mercury. When Ra says, Set will sit in my boat and he will broadcast the messages of Ra to the world, and he will be a protector, you have the small planet Aku or Awuku sitting in the boat of the Aten, the sun. So you have Ra sitting inside of the sun. He operates through the Aten. You have the sun, the Aten, and then you have right in front of the sun, you have Aku or Awuku, the Abosom that operates through that. So you have Mercury and you have the sun. It's the same setup in the murals that we have, of course, in the solar system. Mercury or Awuku is a small planet. It's closest to the sun. It moves around the sun quicker than any other planet. It captures that energy as it's moving around the sun and broadcasts and sends it out to the rest of the solar system. So it is the messenger. So Set, planetary wise, as well as within the divine nervous system of the great divine body within your nervous system, he's a communicator. Okay, hold on one second. Okay, so we're talking about setting, we were talking about dealing with, we talked about desire, the energy moving through the nervous system, generating that desire. If you're out of harmony with that, with divine order, with your desire, then you're outside of the energy of set, and then the desires that you have are misguided. When you're engaging in making decisions, you begin to make misguided decisions. You begin to rationalize things that are not in harmony with order, but you rationalize things that are disordered or imbalanced. If you continue that process, you begin to repel your akra, your akrawa, your ka, your kayat, your ori inu. If you repel your akra and you don't, retrieve it, then like we talked about in the very first session, there are a number of things that can possibly happen. And most people who are engaged in disorder, our people, they don't lose their akra. You'll notice that there are three major things that happen. Imminent death is a symptom of somebody whose akra has detached itself. People engaged in severe antisocial behavior. Now, that's the kind of behavior that we kind of want to focus on, because what we would consider psychopathic behavior. Somebody who has a vulgar disregard for order, for truth, for reality, and is only concerned about their misguided desires. They don't care about anything else. Somebody whose akra has been repelled. Not just somebody who's operating off of conditionings and acting a fool and just, worships the Odwirafo and stuff like that. People who akra is disengaged from them, and now they're engaged in severe antisocial behavior. That's a symptom of the akra having detached and not being reconnected. Even before that happens, you can have people who they have engaged in so much disorder and so much foolishness and have embraced these conditionings that have been placed on us by the whites and their offspring, that their desires are corrupt, they're misguided, and then they employ their adjuni, their mind, to satisfy their desires and communicate their misguided desires. So these people who are outside of Awuku's energy, they begin to rationalize foolishness. So we talked about some of the true story of that on the continent, how we began to accept certain things. So now when you look at Christianity, you look at Islam, you look at Judaism, you look at Hinduism, all these fake traditions that some of our people have embraced, and then they begin to try to rationalize insanity. So then you have black Gnostic Christians, black Hebrews, black Muslims, Moors, Nubians, black Hermeticists, black so-called metaphysicians. People are rationalizing foolishness. They're not in connection with their own kra. They don't even know what that is, because these traditions don't teach them about that. They're not in connection with the Abosom, the Orisha that govern them, because these fake traditions teach against that. They're not in connection with the NANASOM and Samanfo, because most of these traditions are against that. And even those who are involved in what are considered ancestral traditions, if these traditions are connected in some way to the whites and their offspring, they will have the cloak of ancestral traditions, the cloak of the Yoruba tradition, the cloak of the Akan tradition, the cloak of Vodou, the cloak of Igbo tradition, or the Fang tradition in Gabon, or whatever it is, Bakongo. Because they're connected in some way to spirits of disorder, they begin to rationalize disorder. They're disconnected from reality, so they began to rationalize self-destructive behavior. They began to rationalize and have a vulgar disregard for nokware, for truth. So they began to rationalize dissexuality and try to force it into the ancestral culture. They try to rationalize the disorder of connecting with the Odwirafo, who are spirits of disorder. The whites and their offspring incarnate as spirits of disorder. So they cannot practice ancestral religion because they can't even connect with the Abosom. They are repelled by the Abosom. They are repelled by the Nsamafo. They are repelled by Inyamewa Inyame. They don't have an Akra. It's impossible for them to practice ancestral religion or be connected because they are spirits of disorder. But people who are on that lust frequency, and have rejected their own Okra, they begin to try to rationalize the acceptance of the whites and their offspring, spirits of disorder, into a culture of order. And those are the kind of people, some of them write, some of them do videos, some of them publish, some of them are priests and priestesses on the continent of Africa, some of them are Babalao, some of them are AKANFO, Abosom, some of them are Dibias in the Igbo tradition, some of them are Ngangas in the, in the Bakongo tradition, some of them are, Mamisis in the Vodun tradition, Hungans in the Vodun tradition, and so forth. So that's the dilemma. We talk about the dilemma of people who are born on Awukuda, Akuada, who have Anansi, who governs their Okra. If you get out of harmony with that Abosom, with that divinity, and that's for all of us. We're connected to all of the Abosom. Of course, there's one or more that influence us more than others because we were born under the agency of that Abosom. But so this is for all of us, but especially for people born on that day. You see, and if they're Akan, but even if they're not Akan, if they have that Abosom, that Orisha connected to their Ori, to their Okra, then this is a dilemma. If they get out of harmony with that energy, then these people are the type who begin to rationalize the most insane, ridiculous arguments, doctrines, and so forth, and then begin to try to force these false doctrines on other people. These are the kind of people you don't sit around arguing with or debating with, because they have no desire whatsoever to embrace anything truthful. That's not their goal. We mistake these people sometimes for, well, if they just get the right information, that's the only problem. They're just being emotional and they've never been introduced to the right information. That's not their agenda. Their agenda is to fulfill a misguided desire, and that misguided desire is wrapped up in that false doctrine. Their goal is to force the false doctrine to elicit responses that serve their misguided desire. They care nothing about truth. If we don't understand that, we waste a great deal of time, and then we connect with people who may not be doing it in a malicious fashion, but they're still out of harmony with that energy. And you'll see that it's rife throughout the state of ancestral religion in the United States as well as on the continent. So let's see if I saw a couple of, anybody have any questions on that? Okay. Okay, so that's the reason why when we're publishing these documents, and then we talk about very often the corruption going on in priests and priestesses and these various other doctrines that are infiltrating even ancestral religion. Of course, on one hand, it's the whites and their offspring seeking to infiltrate the traditions all over again. So when you, for example, if you type the word Kamit, K-E-M-E-T, in a search engine, the majority of the sites are going to be sites written by the whites and their offspring, very often manufacturing fake little priesthoods and calling themselves Kemetic and talking about doing rituals and all this other foolishness, talking about deities. Of course, none of the deities have ever communicated with them and never will, but you'll see that kind of information. If you type in Obatala or type in Orisha, you're going to get a number of sites dealing with Europeans. Most often, there's going to have something to do with homosexuality in it. They're going to try to associate homosexuality, dissexuality with the Orisha. You have Akan websites where they're talking about all people in the world can come together. They're talking about Jesus, as though this character was real or an ancestor. You have a number of different people, but what happens is people deal with this information in a way, it's very similar to the church. When people think that they have left the church and become a little bit conscious and they've rejected, that kind of information, and they're moving towards something more cultural, they very often bring the same mindset that they brought when they were in the church. So what happens is sometimes they go to Islam or something, sometimes they go to some other tradition. But even when they're starting to study ancestral culture, ancestral religion, true historical information, what they tend to do is just accept what somebody says. And that's the bottom line. It seems very simple, but our people, if we're controlled in that manner and we think like that and we don't investigate, then we trip ourselves up and come into all sorts of problems. We could end most of this misinformation, all of this misinformation in the culture, if people just did some investigation, not just listening to what the lecturer or the author tells you to research. They may tell you to research false information, but anything that anybody tells you, if you just investigate where did this individual get the information from, and you investigate it yourself, and when you get those sources, then you investigate those sources. Eventually it's going to come back to your relationship with your Akra, with your NANASOM and Samanfo, with the Abosom that govern you. But you have to look beyond what people are saying. There are some lecturers, of course, who would tell you on a regular basis, I don't want you to believe nothing I say, look up the information, do the research yourself. That's what is called amongst lecturers and authors a lecturer's trick, because they understand that our people have been conditioned to follow along, and then they feel like they've broken away from that whole paradigm by coming to see this so-called conscious lecturer. So when the conscious lecturer says, I don't want you to believe anything I say, go look it up for yourself, don't believe nothing, do the research. Then the people in the audience, they calculate. They say, man, he said don't believe nothing. He said, in fact, he's recommending that we don't believe what he says and do the research for ourselves. That must mean he's telling the truth. Therefore, I really don't have to research it because he can't be lying. So that even makes them more emboldened not to investigate, because the lecturer has thrown that bit of information out. And they know what they're doing. They do that on purpose so that people will not investigate, so that they can continue to follow the person and be more endeared to the person than they were before he made that statement or before she made that statement. And then on another level, there are some lecturers who will give you that game that I just gave you as a means to get people to follow them even more and put them more on a pedestal, because they're like, man, he just gave us the game. He gave us the lecturer's game. So I don't have to really investigate anything he's saying, because he wouldn't say that and expose himself like that if he wasn't telling the truth, so I don't have to investigate. These are lecturers' tricks. The bottom line is you have to take responsibility for your own development. You must investigate spiritually as well as physically. Physically in the sense of looking at the information, studying information, gathering material from, if you're interested in what somebody has to say or some particular subject or topic, and it sounds like it may be accurate, you have to investigate it. You can gather the material, look at sources and the sources of the sources, but eventually you're going to have to listen to your Akra, listen to the Abosom, listen to the Nsamanfo, and get some real information and ask them to give you confirmation, proof of what the information that you were investigating, and they will always do that. If our people did that, and once our people begin to start doing that, then we can knock all of this information out, all this misinformation out. We'll have a totally different paradigm for embracing ancestral religion. So, and that's one of the reasons we publish the information we do. We release that information for free. We do free presentations so that people can get the information, develop a relationship with their Akra, with the Abosom, with the Nsamanfo, and begin to do this kind of work for themselves, and then for their children, grandchildren, for their family members. And once you ask for confirmation from the Abosom, from the Nsamanfo, they give it to you, and then you will find you're on the same page with other people who are doing the same thing, even if you hadn't even connect with those people in the past, because you're all on the same frequency. So, any questions on that? Okay. Okay, let me see. I saw a couple of statements here. Okay, so the sister asked about how the deities govern your spirit, and another sister said this is also true with brothers and sisters in relationships where one is very African conscious and the other is not. keep trying to get through to the partner who is not awake, or stay with them thinking they will awaken. Now that's the problem. Now some people will say, well, you can't discriminate against people who are not conscious, so-called conscious, who are not trying to study information, because you were there at some point, and you can't just reject people. Sometimes that's accurate, sometimes it's not. A general recommendation would be connect with people who are doing or engaged in the same kind of information, studying and reorienting their lives back to normal, to Inyamewa, Inyame, and Sheshe, divine order, like you are. If they're not, you can be friends with people, you can give people information. If they're inclined to embrace that kind of information on their own, then that's fine. If they're not, or you detect that they're just trying to embrace the information just because you're into it, but eventually they're going to turn their back on it once they feel like the relationship is cemented, then you don't have to deal with that. That's why it's very important to have a direct relationship with your Akra, because your Akra knows instantly whether or not you should deal with that person, because your Nkrabeya, your Nkra, your divine function, is inside your Akra complex. So your Akra already knows whether or not connecting with this individual is part of your Nkrabeya. If it's not, you'll know it right away. Now, very often, and it has nothing to do with people doing ritual practice, very often people know from the first day, the first week, that the person that they've connected with is not the right person. But they continue to ignore these impulses coming from the Akra. They ignore what the Nsamafo have influenced them, the different ideas they've received from the Nsamafo, the influences they've received from the Nsamafo. And after months, or sometimes a year or more, what happens is they go through some big breakup. Then they look back over the course of the time that they were with the person, and they go back Sankofa to the beginning, and they remember when they are across it, leave this person alone. And they'll say something like, something told me I shouldn't be dealing with this person, but I ignored it and just went forward anyway. Our Akra is sometimes very subtle, sometimes it's more forceful, but we need to, on a regular basis, deal with the Akra. That's what our responsibility is. And the more we deal with that, when those messages come, we'll just we'll accept them. And if it's time to reject a particular individual for that kind of relationship, we just honestly let them know this is not going to work. I can feel it, I know, and I'm not going to go against my crowd just because somebody's making promises about what they want to do, what they believe they're going to do, and so forth. If your cross says no, then the answer is no. Okay, so somebody else had a question. Okay, so sister had a question about the calendar and the Abosom, the government days of the week. So this is basically, and this information is covered on the Akradin Abosom page on the website, the Odwirafo.com/Akradin Abosom. In ancient Kamit, they had more than one calendar. All right, one of the calendars, the one you're talking about with regard to the 10 days, there are different constellations that would appear over the horizon, once every 10 days. And, so based on that, 360 days, these different constellations, there are 36 constellations approximately every 10 days. There's 360 days, 3 weeks of 10 days each, which is a 30-day quote-unquote month. And then that 13th month was the 5 days over the year, the epigominal days, and then the year would start over again. But that was based on constellations, certain constellations, those 36 decans, D-E-C-A-N-S, that you would often read about, and those different divinities connected to those constellations, those star systems. So because of the positioning of those different constellations and their apparent movement across the sky, that would determine the number of days. The Akan 7-day week, and you'll find the same 7-day week, of course, in ancient Sumer, which they call, Babylonian. But the Akan 7-day week is based on the positions of the sun, moon, and the 5 planets. So so of course sun, moon, and then you have Awuku, which is Mercury. You have Benna or Abena, which is Mars. You have Yao or Ya, which is Jupiter. You have Afi, which is Venus, and then you have Main, which is Saturn. So based on, like at the first hour of sunrise on Tuesday, you'll find that the planet Abena is in between the sun and the earth, and the energy reflecting off the sun is filtered by the energy of that planet and bathes earth. So that's Bena's day with regard to the planetary powers. The same thing with Awuku on Wednesday, the same thing with Yao on Thursday, and Ya on Thursday, the same thing with Afi on Friday, and same thing with Amen or Saturn on Saturday, and the sun and the moon on Sunday and Monday. So because of the position of the planets and those Abosom that govern those planets, that determines the 7-day week. The movements of the planets, the positions of those 5 planets, and the sun and the moon, that determines a cyclical, well, it's a cycle, it's a 7-day cycle, and it's been repeating itself, of course, just perpetually. So since we already knew the Abosom connected to those planets, and they're the same ones, in ancient Kamit, Set is connected to the planet Mercury, Sobek, and Afi is connected to the planet Venus in ancient Kamit, and Amen is connected to Saturn, which is called Heru Kapet, which is a title of Amen in ancient Kemet. Heru is connected to Yao, called Heru Apsheta is what Jupiter is called. So these are the same Abosom are connected to the same planets in ancient Kemet as well as in Akan culture. In ancient Kemet, they didn't use the 7-day, they weren't focused on the 7-day calendar and the planetary powers and their movements. They were focused on the constellations. And we still, the same Abosom operate through the constellations. You have Alsar operating through Sa, which they call Orion. You have Aset operating through Sapatit, which they call Sirius, and so forth. So, and Set operating through Mesketiu, which is the Great Bear. So the Abosom operate on the stellar plane, through the solar phases, through the lunar phases, through different parts of the earth like the oceans, rivers, sky, the core of the earth, and black soil, the red soil, desert as well as red clay, earth, different parts of mountains. So they operate on every level, and of course they operate in the organs and systems of your body and the different divisions of your spirit. So the Abosom operate on all those different levels. The Ntoru operate on all those different levels. Because of where we were and where we migrated to, we focused on the different movements of the planets. We knew the same Abosom operate through those planets, so since we focused on the 7-day cycle, then we were also focused on those different divinities. We're not named after the days. Yes, the days are named after the divinity that governs that particular planet. So because of the movement, the position of Awuku on a particular day, that planet Awuku or Mercury, then that day, that day is named after Awuku because that his planet bathes the earth with a certain amount of energy on that day. Yao's planet, Yao, Jupiter, bathes the earth with energy on that particular day. So it's called Yao Da or Yao's Day. The same thing with all the other days. They're named after the solar, lunar, or planetary power that governs the earth on that day. The reason we are sent into the world on that day is because before we incarnated, our spirits, go up to Inyamewa. Inyame, we're given an Akra, given a function, and Nkrabia, giving the tools to execute that function, the She and the Shebia, the spiritual capacities. We're connected with an Abosom. So if we're connected with Yao, with Heru, in the spirit realm, he's associated with our Akra. He's assigned to us. We're assigned to Yao. Our Akra is assigned to Yao in the spirit realm. And then we await incarnation, and then our spirits are sent into the mother's womb when our mother and father copulate and that spirit is drawn to the womb. because we were assigned to Yao, our cry was assigned to Yao in the spirit realm, because of the relationship we have with these Abosom, we will be born on Yao. Even if there are complications, somebody's getting a C-section or whatever, the baby is not going to come out until his day comes up. So our being born on that particular day is a revelation or a manifestation or an indication of what had taken place in the spirit realm. It's a confirmation of that. We don't just happen to be born on any day, and whatever day we come out, then we're named after the day. The reason why we come out is because Yao will send us into the world on that day. He will allow the birth to happen on his day. And in the same way, for example, in the Yoruba tradition or the Igbo tradition or whatever spirit that is governing the ori of the person or the chi of the person or the say, they call it the say in Vodun, they will make sure if they have sacred days, like the Igbo have a 4-day week, their divinity is connected with their 4 days. Everybody doesn't use a day naming system. The Yoruba have a 5-day inclusive week, the Igbo have a 4-day week, the Akan uses a 7-day week. But no matter what it is, whatever Orisha, Abosom, Arusi governs the person's cry, they will make sure that that person is born under certain conditions to indicate what Abosom is governing them. Whether even same thing in ancient Kamit, no matter what calendar they were using, if we're connected to a certain Ntoru or Ntortu, one of the divinities, then we're going to come out on a day or a specific time that indicates the particular divinity that governs us, no matter what the calendar is. If that makes sense. Okay. And there was a question about Sister Sankofa Safo said, we did touch on the similarity between Anansi and Eshu, showing these are the same divinities. We talked about the weaving of the web and Anansi governing that web of energy or tumi or ashe that permeates, just like the web permeates the space in a window. The web of tumi or ashe or life force energy, divine energy, permeates the entire blackness of space. Every one of us have a thread of that web connected to our cry, our ori on one end, and going directly to Inyame on the other end. So everybody who has an Akra, has an ori, are connected to Anansi's web, and therefore he can facilitate communication between all of us. You mentioned about the weaving of the stories, Weaver of Fate and Destinies, not just tales. Now they talk about Anansi being the owner of all the stories of Inyamewa Inyame, and they call them Anansi Sem. But that also has to do with like these stories are dealing with trickster stories and stuff like that. But all of them have lessons in them. When you look at Anansi, you look at these so-called trickster stories, before you engage in behavior, of course that's the final result of what was taking place in your Arjwani, what was taking place in your thoughts. We talked about Anansi as his energy is circulating through the nervous system and generating that emanation of energy that manifests as desire. And if you're in harmony, if your desire is in harmony with divine order, you're in balance. If your desire is out of harmony with divine order, it's misguided and it becomes lust. And now you have stepped away from Anansi, you've stepped away from Eshu, and so forth. So when he's weaving these stories, and you have all these different stories of Eshu, trickster stories, you have all these different stories of Anansi, which are trickster stories or considered trickster stories. What's happening is when you engage in thoughts and you have intentions manifest as desires, those things have consequences. So Anansi can lay out all of the possible consequences based on the decisions that you make. He can lay them out for you before you engage in the behavior. And now you can make a decision. Many of these stories are what will happen if you engage in this behavior. What path that you're on, that you're about to be on, so that therefore you can make a different decision and get off that path. He lays out in a future sense what your possible quote-unquote parallel universe will be if you engage in that behavior. So you can shift gears before you act on the thought, the intention, and you don't manifest it as an action. That's a very valuable instrument. That's why Anansi is very valuable, but at the same time, if you're out of harmony with him, then you begin to engage in misguided desire, you begin to rationalize foolishness, and then you lay out all kinds of scenarios of what is going to happen that you think is going to benefit you, and in reality, it's going to be self-destructive. So getting in harmony with Anansi, he mediates the possibility of disorder, because like we said, he sits on the perimeter of order, and anything outside of that perimeter, you have gone beyond Anansi, and now you're eligible for being cut off, being punished, being eradicated. But if you're inside the perimeter and all the possibilities of roads within the, he's the Eshu, sits at the crossroads, and of course the spider web has all the different roads, but Anansi knows if you get on this road, what's going to happen. Only the spider knows what's going to happen when you get on the web, because he runs the web. So if you're in communication with Anansi and you're about to make decisions, you need to be in alignment with him. And this anybody connected to any Abosom, Anansi is connected to all of the Abosom. Just like all the organs in your body are interrelated, interconnected, all of us are connected to the various Abosom, all the Akradinbosom. We just have one or more that are more dominant than all the others, because we're assigned to them to bring their energy into the world. But when we're talking about making decisions, making sound decisions, having a decision-making process, and if you look in the Ptah book that we have on the website, on the Ptah page, we have a 7-step decision-making process that's based on the Abosom of the 7 days of the week, and you can read that. It's detailed in the text. But when it comes to making decisions, that determines the quality of your life. If you make bad decisions, that determines how your life is going to turn out. If you make good decisions, harmonious decisions, that impacts your life in a positive fashion. So the difference between an adult and a child is not just physiological. It's about, adults make decisions that are in harmony with order. They have a sound decision-making process where they gather information and they move in a direction that's supportive of their actual life focus. Children, whether they're older or younger, whether they're over 21 or not, they make decisions based on what feels good, whether it's false conditioning or if it's real. So they make decisions based on misguided desire, whereas an adult, somebody who's mature, makes decisions based on, is it in harmony with order? If it's not in harmony with order, then we don't embrace it. If it's in harmony with order, then we move forward. So Anansi, when he's weaving these stories or weaving that web, he's laying out the different possibilities, potentialities, and then you can make a decision before you engage that. Or if you're already in the process and you need to backtrack and reroute, then Anansi can give you the various possibilities based on the decision you're about to make, and then you can switch lanes. Okay. All right, so any other questions on that with regard to Anansi, regard to Awuku? Okay, so we just wanted to cover that with him. Well, actually, there's one more thing. Of course, we talk about him as the divine communicator, operating through the planet, Awuku, Mercury, operating through your nervous system, operating through the red earth, we talked about that, the desert. And one of the reasons he's connected with the desert is red hot, of course. So he's also connected. When you look at your nervous system, you have brain with 2 hemispheres here, and then you also have the brain, which separate hemispheres, which is the testes of the male and ovaries of the female. So that's like a minor brain and the major brain, and they're both connected, of course, to the nervous system, and they're called the gonads. In literature, it is through the gonads where you generate heat, you generate fire, you get fired up. And Set operates through the gonads, with the male and the female. And then his wife Nebuchadnezzar also is connected. So when they talk about Set governing the hot, dry, red areas of the earth, which is the desert, they're talking about the hot, dry areas where you become fired up. You can get fired up through your heart, which is Heru. You can also get fired up through the gonads, through Set. So we were talking about that, but we wanted to talk a little bit about, we talked about how one of the titles of Set, or Kwekwe Nanse, is Eku Sika. And we said that, in Yoruba tradition, they'll say that Eshu is in the bank. It's a medium of exchange. In Akan culture, Awuku is called Aku or Eku Sika. Sika meaning gold, inferring money. It's a medium of exchange. It's through that exchange that we communicate our desires with one another, whether they're in harmony with order or not. If they're out of harmony with order, then that Sika or that money can create a number of different problems. If it's in harmony with order, it can grease the wheels of a sound economy. However, when we deal with Sika, or money, this medium of exchange, this instrument of Awuku in connection with ancestral religion, then all of a sudden we have a problem. Do the Abosom or the Orisha or the Vodou, do they ask people for money? Of course they don't ask people for money. They're not sitting around waiting for people to pull dollar bills out. Dollar bills or credit cards are not going to do anything for the forces of nature. The sun's corona 4 million degrees Fahrenheit. What is a dollar going to do for the sun? You're going to pull out a dollar and try to, get in a space shuttle and fly out to the sun and hand the sun a dollar so you can get something done. Or what is the planet Bena, Abena, so-called Mars, going to do with, a couple of coins? Money is asked for individuals. Typically, in authentic ancestral religious practices, the people do the work because that's part of their nkrabeya. It's part of their function, their ayanmo. They came into the world to function as a vessel for the Abosom in the human sphere, the Afurakani, Afuraikaitni human sphere, of course, only. Just like plant life has an nkrabeya, mineral life has an nkrabeya, just every aspect of life has an nkrabeya. Plant life, mineral life, everything. Human life, meaning Afurakani, Afuraikaitni, we have an nkrabeya as well. So there are certain plants, and we mentioned this before, part of their nkrabeya is just like a human being can be an AKANFO, an Abosomfo, a vessel for the Abosom to come into the world for possession and so forth. There are certain plants whose produce, or certain plants can be a vessel for the Abosom's energy to operate through. So you'll find that there are sacred plants that are sacred to certain Abosom, like the Odum tree in Akan culture, the Onyina tree, or the Iroko in Yoruba tradition, and Loko in Vodun. There are certain plants, plant life, certain rock formations and so forth that get possessed or the Abosom operate through. There are certain Achinebois or animals that are animal totems that are connected to different Abosom, right? So there are certain plants that, part of their nkrabeya is for their produce to function as a battery of energy to transfer energy through ritual processes. If that particular plant has that nkrabeya, then we can use that particular plant for an offering, for an aforeba in Akan culture, eba in Yoruba culture, for an offering, for a sacrificial offering, because their part of their nkrabeya is to sacrifice an aspect of themselves for the Abosom, just like part of the nkrabeya of a small percentage of our people is to become Okomfo, Abosomfo, priests and priestesses. We sacrifice our daily independence so that we can function as a vessel for the Abosom to operate in the human sphere. There are certain plants that have that nkrabeya. If they have that, then we can utilize those plants or certain animals for offering. If they don't have that nkrabeya, it's useless. You can't use them for that because that's not why they came into the world. They were not sent into the world by Inyame wa Inyame to function in that capacity, so you're wasting your time. So you have to be able to not only do some rudimentary divination, but communicate with the spirit of the plant, communicate with the spirit of that particular animal to see if this is one of the ones that's supposed to be used in that fashion. Okay, so just like, plants, animals, minerals, and so forth, also us, some of us have that, we have that function. That's what we're supposed to do. Paper money, credit cards, other forms of money, they don't have that function. Money doesn't have an Akra. A dollar bill doesn't have an Akra. It wasn't created by the Supreme Being to serve as a vessel for the Abosom to operate through. There are media of exchange, and that process of exchange is governed by Anansi, and we can use certain things like Inseterwa, like cowrie shells, or gold like we've used, or different minerals or sacred objects to exchange energy to a certain extent. But the Abosom are not asking for money. The Orisha are not asking for money. People are asking for money. This is a corruption that has taken place over the past couple of 100 years on the continent. People have been engaged in the process of their dealing with discarnate, wayward spirits, not really dealing with the Abosom, not really dealing with Orisha, not really dealing with Vodou, but just dealing with discarnate, dead relatives, and some spirits that are not relatives, but earthbound spirits that have been around, some of them for thousands of years, some of them for millions of years. There are earthbound spirits around, just like there's bacteria throughout the earth. There are earthbound spirits, people who have died and who have been dwelling in different parts of the world for millions of years. There are some people who are been there for thousands of years. Some people have been there for hundreds of years. Most of our people, when we make a transition, we transition to the ancestral realm. Some of us become and remain earthbound. So people end up having the services of these earthbound spirits and then passing them off as Abosom. These earthbound spirits who are wayward, who are out of harmony with order, some of them malicious, some of them not malicious, just depressed or misguided, controlled by lust when they were on earth, and they're the same way when they made their transition. These are individual spirits who will ask for different things. If you're trying to get something done, no different than, we talked about this before, just like a crackhead, you give them something as long as they get something that can take some energy in, that drug, they'll do whatever you ask them to do. If you ask them to rob, steal something from somebody, some of them may try to kill somebody for you. If you promise to give them this chemical that's going to give them a rush of energy, they'll deny food, deny sex, to deny the comforts of a home and so forth, just to get that rush of energy. And then when the energy is over with, they're seeking that rush of energy again. That's that addiction. Some of those spirits, when they die, it's the same thing. Some people have that addiction. It's not drugs. It has to do with sex or different other, different things that people are addicted to. So when they make their transition, their spirits are still controlled by that lustful kind of disordered energy. So if you promise to give them something that's going to release some energy, and they can be filled up by that energy, then hey, they'll do it for you because you will make a sacrifice. You'll sacrifice an animal. You'll release some energy. You'll give an offering of food or some other kind of offering. You'll release some energy, so they will do some work for you. They will go communicate with somebody or influence somebody's thoughts or do whatever. So people have been working with spirits like that for thousands of years, but in our traditional cultures, we always understood who's doing real work and who's dealing with wayward discarnate spirits. Sometimes they call it negative witchcraft and things like that. Sometimes these things are misnomered. Some people are doing criminal things with these spirits and some people are not. But our people have always understood there are people engaged in those practices, and then you have the majority of the population who are trying to do things in a sensible way, and they're trying to connect with the Abosom, the Orisha who govern them. Over the past 100, 200 years, especially since the perversion of Islam in West Africa, those black people who connected with the whites and their offspring and accepted Islam for political expedience purposes because they were trying to wage war against one black group and another black group, and some groups wanted the upper hand, so they wanted to join up with another group, these white Arabs, who may be able to help them if they united to defeat the other black group who was their enemy, because the Arabs couldn't defeat them The other black group couldn't defeat them. If they united, then they could defeat them. So then they would accept these fake traditions and begin to engage in that process. Some of them that would satisfy their lusts. They start repelling their Akra. Now the only spirits they can deal with when they're embracing even some form of Islam are discarnate wayward spirits, because the Abosom have nothing to do with any form of Islam, any form of Moorishism, any form of any of that foolishness. So now they're working with discarnate spirits and trying to get work done. They're trying to get their lusts met. They're not real needs, they're false needs met. They've been engaged in these processes for years. Ancient Ghana, ancient Mali, ancient Songhai. One of the reasons why the Akan people migrated away from ancient Ghana was because of the Muslim invasions, the invasions of the Almohad, Almoravid groups. People left the ancient empire of Mali and Songhai because of these invasions, because of the corruption. The Akan people moved south towards the forest belt where they are now in regions of contemporary Ghana and Ivory Coast, and reestablished Akan civilization about 800 to 1,000 years ago. Different groups were incrementally coming down, but by the time 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago came about, we had reestablished Akan civilization, devoid of Islam, of course, and devoid of Christianity, any of that, because the reason we left was to maintain our culture. It was the same with the Dogon. They moved higher up into the mountains and the cliffs because they were moving away from that corruption. They saw how corrupt things were, so they wanted to preserve their culture, and they moved up. We want to preserve our culture, and we saw some of our people engaged in foolishness, and they didn't want to turn back like drug addicts, so we decided we're going to move south and reestablish Akan civilization in the south. So we did that. But there were some people who brought some of that foolishness in. There were some Asante Hene, there were some Akan groups, like some Bono people, various Akan groups. Some of them, the majority of them, did not do that. But some of them started allowing, these Muslim infiltrators into the organizations, into their societies, sometimes for trade, but very often they're trying to wage war. They're engaged in empire building. They're waging war against some groups that are Muslim, some who are influenced by that, other ones who are not. Some of them trying to force Islam on the rest of the people. You'll see names like Kramo, which is a term for Muslim in Akan. You'll see some of the names of a couple of the Oheni going back hundreds of years, like Yao, Kramo, and some of the names of some of these spirits that they were dealing with. These were deceased spirits who were Muslim, and they're dealing with those spirits. Some of them would even try to pass them off as Abosom. That started going on a few hundred years ago. You can see that in written documentation in the 12,700s, which they call the 1700s. So they were engaged in these processes. They started dealing with a lot of talismanic magic, because the Muslims, they deal with that more than any other group. The reason why the Muslims are known for selling talismans all over Africa, especially in West Africa, because they don't deal with any real Abosom. There's not a melding of traditional culture and Islamic culture, and they're still working with the deities as well as praying to Allah and stuff like that. As soon as you start embracing the fictional character Allah and these false prophets who never existed, the Abosom have nothing to do with that. They're not melding culture. They're not melding Islam with anything. They're not melding Hebrewism. They're not melding Christianity. The Abosom are not dealing with Muslims. The Abosom are not dealing with, or the Vodou are not dealing with Muslims or Christians. The Orisha are not dealing with Muslims and Christians. So when people are talking about, well, they preserve the culture and they're practicing both at the same time, so they have an African form of Islam and they have an African form of Christianity, they have an African form of Hebrewism, that's pure foolishness. The Abosom have left them alone. Now the only spirits left that they can deal with are discarnate, wayward spirits, earthbound spirits, and so the proliferation of talismans took place and is still going on right now. So these people dealing with these talismans, dealing with these earthbound spirits, they started basically setting up businesses where they sell talismans, sell shrines. They consult with the spirits who are connected to these talismans, which are just discarnate wayward spirits. They give them give them something in exchange that would generate them some energy for, a task that they want them to complete. And it became a business. So establishing a shrine becomes a business. They deal with these spirits as though these spirits are their employees. You do this for me, then I'll give you this. If you don't do this for me, I'm not giving you anything. And if you continue to not work for me, then I'm going to throw your shrine out and I'm going to find a spirit, I'm going to find a shrine that does the work that I'm trying to get done. And, you'll hear people talking like that. But then when they misclassify these spirits as Abosom, misclassify them as Vodou, misclassify them as Orisha, misclassify them as Arusi in the Igbo tradition, then they began to promote this foolish doctrine of, well, we don't worship the Abosom work for us. We don't worship the Vodou work for us. We tell them what to do, we demand it. That's pure foolishness, because these people are not dealing with any Abosom. They're not dealing with Vodou, they're not dealing with any Orisha. They're dealing with wayward, discarnate spirits. So they set up these businesses, just like no different than you set up an agreement with a drug addict. You do this for me and I'll give you something. If you don't, you get nothing. And this has become very popular. At the same time, you have the pressure of the whites and their offspring with Christianity and their fake governmental systems, and there were wars and everything happening from the 12,700s, 1800s, 1900s up until today, and them setting up missionary schools, and some of our people thinking that they're playing one group off against the other, thinking they're being intelligent, but in reality they're selling their culture away. So what happens is, at this point, you have the manifestation of cultural infection. Not only externally, where you see the majority of the women straightening out their hair, a lot of people lightening up their skin, they have white Jesus pictures, or sometimes black ones, but very often white ones. Either way, he never existed. All over places like Ghana and Kenya and Uganda and different places, there's a manifestation of that infection there. But in the ancestral traditions, there's such an entrenched corruption that came from what was taking place a couple of hundred years ago that people think that's the traditional culture. So this whole idea of we have to give the spirits money or else they're not going to work for us, or we have to spend thousands of dollars to be initiated to an Abosom, to an Orisha, that has nothing to do with the culture. That's a representation of a recent, and for us, 200 years is nothing. We've been here for millions of years. When we talk about ancient Kamit, we glibly talk about, about 5,000 years ago, 6,000, 7,000. 200 years is nothing compared to how long we've been here and how long we've established and maintained civilizations. So over the past couple of hundred years, this corruption has become entrenched. Every year it's become more entrenched. This appears to be the ancestral culture. So when you ask people from the continent, how long have you been doing, engaging the culture in this fashion? They'll say, well, ever since we can remember. They can tell you about 10, 11, 12 generations back, hundreds of years ago, when their people were doing this the way they're doing it now. And they were doing it that way, because over 1,000 years ago, they were up in, further up north, and they were engaged with this infected culture, with these blacks who become Muslims or engaged in that foolishness, and they've been engaged in a corrupt form of the culture for over a millennium. So yes, as far back as they can remember, they've been engaged in a corrupt culture. So in reality, the Abosom are assigned to you pre-incarnation. If you are to serve as a vessel for Awusi or Akwia or Awuku, if that is your Nkravia, that was given to you pre-incarnation. When you incarnate into the world, at some point, the Abosom is going to manifest itself. Awuku or Awusi or Ajua or Akwia will possess the person, will communicate through the person to the community. And then it's the responsibility of elders and elderesses, NANASOM Mpanyinfo, in the community to take their responsibility and begin to protect and guide the person in a proper fashion. The Abosom that was assigned to you pre-incarnation did not require that you come up with $7,000 or else they're not going to possess you. That's foolishness. People are not dealing with the real culture. This is why we said, and when you read the article on Awuku, people who are engaged in misguided desire, then they're rejecting order and they begin to rationalize. They use the same faculty that Awuku governs, which is communication. They use that faculty that he rules to serve misguided desire, so their communications become corrupt and they begin to rationalize the most insane practices and have, as we said, a vulgar disregard for truth. They're only concerned about their desire, and they wrap all kinds of philosophies and rationales and proverbial pseudo-wisdom all to support their lust and misguided desire. Okay. Okay, so Nana sister said that money is also for the supplies needed and ritual items being made for the devotee, not for someone's mortgage. Right. So what happens is, typically in a traditional culture, we always had our own land. Everybody had their own plot of land. Man has his own plot of land, inherited from his ancestresses and ancestors. Female had the wife had her own plot of land. The husband had his own plot of land. We were growing crops, and everything we needed we could provide for ourselves. Some people, beyond providing for themselves, having provisions for themselves, will go beyond that and begin to create things, whether it was sculptures, whether it was some metallurgical work, some basket weaving or whatever it was, to engage in public works for the benefit of the community. They could also generate some revenue that way. But as far as what we needed, our own homes, our own land, our own medicines, we could take care of that with what we had. We were not dependent on somebody giving us something in order to survive. That's never been part of our culture. So a priest or a priestess, somebody who's initiated, or Konfo, Abosomfo, they weren't dependent on the community bringing them animals because they had their own animals. They weren't dependent on the community bringing them fruits and vegetables because they grew everything they needed. They grew their own cassava, they grew their own greens, they grew everything they needed to survive. Everybody did that. So they weren't dependent on spiritual work in order to get some revenue to survive. So their spiritual work was outside of their meeting their basic needs. Their spiritual work was based on, my Akra has directed me to be a vessel of this Abosom so we can maintain harmony in the community. So they would engage in that work. For the people who were engaged in the kind of pseudo-spiritual work that was destructive, then the people will pull away from them, and of course they wouldn't have any clients. And then sometimes they would be executed. So there's a check and a balance. The people who are doing good work, some people would come forward after when they would do good work, and they would, support them, give them gifts, support them in various ways. But that wasn't the criteria for them doing the work. If you're a child of Awuku and you're supposed to function as a vessel of Awuku, and if somebody needs, the energy of Awuku and the direction and guidance of Awuku, they come to you and you give them the guidance. You give them the rituals that are necessary to get them in harmony with order. That's your job. Just like your heart pumps, that's his job. Your lungs, inhale and exhale, that's his job. If you have an Nkrabia, whatever your Nkrabia is, that is your job. Your responsibility is living in harmony with Inyame wa Inyame, the way they made you, the way they birthed you, the way they fashioned you, the way they formed you. That's your job. So you're not looking for payment for that. If you execute your responsibilities with order and with honor, then some people will recognize that, and when they can give you something or support you in any way, then they'll do so, and that's normal. But you don't do it because that's what you're looking for. That's the difference. There was another statement. Right, and you said also the asking of money has been abused by corrupt elders, eldresses misinterpreting the Odu and Ifa. And that's true, and then it's also the same thing in Vodou, it's the same thing in the Akan tradition, just across the board. And the reality is people are not really dealing with these Abosom. My sister asked a question previously about, what if you get a reading from one priest, like an Ifa priest, and they say a certain Orisha governs your head, but then you go to, somebody else has told you from a different tradition that it's a different spirit. If people are dealing with the actual divinities, which a lot of these people are not, they just go get an initiation, they spend a number of days, in the Igbo do or whatever, or in the, in Samain Po, the ancestral grove in our Akan tradition. What happens is they're not dealing with actual Abosom. Many of them are not even dealing with the NANASOM and Samanfo. They're just dealing with, discarnate spirits that either are around them or in the environment. So they can't communicate with these Abosom. If you have a real diviner who's authentic, when you come into the room, even before you come into the room, when you come into the room, your Abosom is with you. They can communicate with that Abosom. Many of them can see them, they can hear them, they can feel them, they can communicate directly with the Abosom, directly with the Orisha. And if this Orisha is Bena, Ogun, then the Abosom, the Orisha, will tell them, this is who I am. And if you go to another diviner from a different tradition, and they can actually communicate and see this Abosom and communicate with them, Abosom's not going to lie. They're going to say, my name is Bena, in this tradition. So what'll happen is if you go to an Akan person who knows what they're doing, they'll communicate with that Abosom. The Abosom will say, my name is Bena, Neye Bena, you know what I'm saying? And the same thing, if that same person goes to a Yoruba person, they know that Abosom as the Orisha, Ogun, and that spirit will tell them, this is who I am. So it's impossible for there to be a discrepancy. The only reason there will be a discrepancy is when you have people who don't know what they're doing. People who really cannot communicate with the Abosom. And I gave the example of if you were in a room and you had your child in the room and then you had your brothers and sisters in the room and somebody came in and said, whose child is this? And you said, well, this is my child. Then the person knows that's, your child. If another person from another tradition came into the room and said, whose child is this? And you say, this is my child, they know it's your child because they can communicate with you. They can look directly at you, listen to you, and you're telling them, this is my child. They may come from different traditions and have different languages, like an Akan and a Yoruba, but when they get together, they'll say, well, in my language, this person, she said, this is her child. We call her Akua in my language, but this child, her mother is Akua. And then the Yoruba person will say, well, in my language, the name we use is Agberu, but Agberu right there, that's this girl's mother, because they can communicate with the person. All right. Okay, any other information, any other questions on that? And the final thing with that is, again, we must develop a relationship with our Akra, Akrawa, the Ori Inu, the Se. Develop a relationship with the NANASOM and Samanfo. We have the articles about establishing an ancestral shrine. The Nkomre article, Ancestral Shrine Communication, Nsama Nkomre, and Nsama Nkom and the Seven Senses, which is talking about ancestral communication and the seven senses, because very often the Samanfo are communicating with us and we don't readily recognize the different ways that they communicate. We have an article called Nsama Nkomre, Ancestral Shrines and Kamit, which just shows different pictures and gives some information about that. And then we have information about the Akra, and we're going to be publishing some more information. So when you deal with the Akra, deal with your Nsamafo, deal with the Abosom, then you can get real answers about your descent, about your ancestral clan, where you actually come from. You should get that directly from your great-great-great-grandparents. They're the ones not only who know exactly who you are, they walk with you, but it's their responsibility to give you that information, and they want to give you that information. So you don't have to go to somebody else to tell you, because even if somebody tells you something, at some point you're going to have to ask your Akra, ask your Nsamafo, is what this person told me in this reading or whatever is true. So you might as well go directly to them first and last. So if there's no other questions, we're going to end it here. The next session is going to be dealing with Akua, the Abosom Akua, also called Aquia. In ancient Kamit, she's called Nebethet. In Yoruba, she's called Agberu, and we'll be called Koni Koni in Vodun, and we'll be talking about that in the next session. So, Medase for checking us out, and we'll be posting the video online once it's processed. Medase.